Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for being here with me today. My name is Natalia de Magala. I'm the head of data ethics at the Government Digital Service, a part of the Cabinet Office in the UK, and I'm really delighted to be chairing this event on algorithmic transparency. So I'm joined here by a fantastic group of experts and practitioners of open data and open algorithms, and please give a warm welcome to our wonderful experts. So we have Dr. Millie Zimeta, the head of public policy at the Open Data Institute. We have Swazik Peniko, who's the head of capacity building at Etalab, French government. We've got Tonu Basu, who's the deputy director of thematic policy areas at the Open Government Partnership. And finally, we have the New York's very own Alex Ford, who's an algorithm management and policy officer at the New York City Mayor's Office of Operations. And before I turn to our speakers, I'd like to start with a quick introduction. So there are various definitions and interpretations of algorithmic transparency, but it can be broadly understood as openness about the purpose, structure, and underlying actions of algorithms used to process information. In the public sector, algorithms support many of the highest impact decisions affecting individuals. For example, decisions related to individual liberty or essential public services. And due to this extremely significant impact that algorithmic assisted decisions made by public sector organizations can have, there is a need to provide the highest possible standards of transparency and accountability for the public. And this is what we'll be discussing today. And globally, we currently lack a consistent, systematic approach to algorithmic transparency mechanisms. There are no universal standards for algorithmic transparency, and what this means in practice is that various mechanisms of algorithmic transparency can include publishing information on the following issues. So organization, where the algorithm is being used, any external partners involved, purpose of the algorithm, description of how it was designed, description of how it works, more details on the decisions, so how the algorithm is used, why an algorithm is needed, and description of the expected impacts of using this algorithm, as well as various descriptions of the human input into all these processes. And there are further considerations on how this information should be presented. For example, should we be using the existing open data standards and open data platforms? And today, building on the wealth of knowledge and experience we gathered from years of working on open data, and open data is a foundation of any algorithmic transparency initiatives. So I would like to kick off this conversation with a question to my excellent panelists. In your opinion, how is algorithmic transparency different from open data? And I would like to start with Tonu. Over to you.
Thanks, Natalia, and thanks again for the organizers for this fantastic Open Data Week. Great to be part of it. So I think we're really getting to the heart of it, right? Algorithmic transparency, as I see it, is mainly about the system of data use and the decisions that it enables. So a lot of people see this as what the data enables versus the data itself when it comes to policy decisions. But I really think it's very much, it sort of boils down to the shared purpose for any of us working in open government or open data. The goal needs to be that both the policy decisions as well as the decision-making processes and the data behind them are made open for public scrutiny and engagement. So in that sense, it is important that both the data about decisions, both within and without automated systems, are proactively made available to the public. But especially where these automated systems are, as you said, Natalia, informing decisions about individual liberty or access to public services, it's important that these the transparency extends to this as well. And I think finally, one of the most important points around algorithms versus data is that it's important that we don't focus around the transparency of the software, the tool, and often conversations around algorithmic transparency boils down to that. But really, as much as we do with data, how do we focus on the impact that comes from? I think that's what it boils down to.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Really important points. So I would like to ask the same question to Alex. How is algorithmic transparency different from open data?
Sure, yeah. Well, first, just to reiterate the thanks to both organizers and panelists and attendees, because this is very exciting. So very happy to be here. I couldn't agree with Tonu more. What we think about in terms of algorithms has to be thought of as a system. It's not just it is not just a set of data. It is not just a line of code. It's a system of components, including the data and code, but that also reflect things like qualitative decision-making, policy choices, external regulation. So where I would identify the key difference between open data and open algorithms is a question of form and function. What is it that we're actually trying to communicate, and how do we actually communicate that? We are so accustomed to seeing open data in our, tabular two-dimensional forms, granted replete with tons of metadata and rich explanations and understandings about the way that those data work. But I think when we talk about open algorithms, we're just talking about a different form, and how we present that information and how we communicate that information by necessity is going to be a different form than what we see for open data.
Great, thank you very much. Millie, same question. How is algorithmic transparency different from open data?
Brilliant, thank you. So I'm one of those people that sees algorithms as maybe a method rather than a resource in comparison to data. I guess I'd say that data itself, and open data in particular, has a range of use cases, not all of which are algorithmic. But I see algorithms as a particular technology being implemented now because of the possibilities of rich data sets. I think also, Natalia, you mentioned briefly that the algorithms can have huge impacts, but some of those impacts arise because of data gaps, for example, or biases in the data. So that's really important. And I guess I'd also flag that those data gaps or biases in data can be a risk or issue even without an algorithm being developed and implemented off the back of them. So I would really welcome more attention paid to the importance of data infrastructure, and I welcome the attention that algorithms are drawing to this issue.
Thank you, Millie, and we can definitely cover those points in data infrastructure later on as well. Swati?
Sure. So first, thank you. I reiterate the thank yous to everybody, panelists, organizers, Natalia, for putting this all together. I'm very, very excited about the conversation today. I think everything my co-panelists said is already very relevant. One thing maybe I would highlight is more about the context in which we're speaking. And please correct me, especially even in the conversation, because my point of view might be very partial and Western centric. But I feel like when the open data movement sort of started, there was a lot of enthusiasm about the possibilities of open data. So there was this component of open government, but also there was a lot of excitement about reuses, maybe economic promises and all of this. Whereas with the algorithmic transparency movement, the defining moment sort of this year, and this is again very Western centric, but where the I'm gonna say F the algorithm protests in the UK about the UCAS algorithm, which was a much angrier take on the topic. And I feel like it also comes in a time where there's a lot of defiance in institutions, even more so than a few years ago. And I feel like
question
element sort of unites open data.
So I'm sending Slido details in the chat now, so you can all go to the website, Slido, and the code for this event is open algorithms. And this way you can ask questions to our panelists that I will moderate and towards the end of this event. So just a lot to on point of that. Okay, so let's dig a little bit deeper into this. So I have a question to Millie now. How do drivers for open data compare to drivers for algorithmic transparency?
So Aziz mentioned it slightly. So I see the open data movement as having a couple of strands, or a few strands. So one is the open science movement, where the benefits of open science are around the work becoming more robust and more rigorous, and the kind of the collective advancement. So, if everyone can kind of collaborate on a piece of work across national borders and across disciplines, then the benefits of the knowledge are shared and the field progresses collectively. I also think that open analytics allows for innovation methods. So it's both testing the work for rigor and robustness, but also allowing more innovation in methods itself. So that's the open science strand of open data. And then there's the open government strand, and that's about sort of civic transparency and accountability. And I think it was Tonu who mentioned there's also kind of areas around open data for the economy. So that's the free flow of data and open standards for trade and for innovation, and also for social equity, which is really important. So there's these kind of three areas in the open data movement as I see them. I think so far the discussion around algorithmic transparency has tended to speak to open government, because it's been about the kind of accountability and transparency of the use of algorithms in government. So it's that open government strand. But I think it's important to consider the benefits from open science, for example, open analytics and robustness in methods. But also around open data for the economy. So that's thinking about innovation, and it's thinking about social equity and the benefits being distributed more equitably across society and across national borders.
And is there anything you would recommend on how we can collectively work to maybe bring this open science angle to the open algorithms conversation?
I don't know. I wonder whether it's about finding the right use cases that would either benefit the most from that kind of collective creation of rigor and robustness, but also where there's more scope for innovation in methods, so that the benefits, the opportunities are clearer. But maybe also the use cases that are of interest internationally. So again, we experience the benefits of that being not constrained by national borders. So maybe finding a use case that can speak to all three, or different use cases, a portfolio of use cases that can explore that in more detail.
Great, thank you. And I'm sure we can all collectively as a movement work on finding those use cases and documenting them. So let's turn to Alex now. New York City has a very mature open data ecosystem, and we always give the work done on open data in New York as one of the examples of how it should be done in many cases. So how did you tap on this wealth of experience when you were developing the system for algorithmic transparency reporting? And I'd also be keen to know what were the main differences and similarities between open data and algorithmic transparency reporting in New York City.
Yeah, I appreciate any opportunity to talk about the similarities. I know we opened with the question talking about the differences, but there's actually a lot that we can go with. And Millie just pointed out sort of the conceptual drivers. I think what I would point to is a lot of similar process components to the open data process that we were able to tap right into. Both at MODA, the office responsible for open data within the mayor's office, and our group are all under the same mayor's office umbrella. So we have the luxury and the privilege of proximity to the open data experience, to the open data staff, and borrowed a lot of straightforward process intel from them, I guess you could say. When you think about compliance, which is what we're getting at with transparency, compliance is not just the requirements. You have to take those requirements and you have to translate that into a set of steps or actions that you're actually asking agencies to do. And our open data team in New York was extremely helpful in helping us to borrow some of those best practices. There were definitely areas where we did not have to reinvent the wheel, where we didn't have to start completely from scratch. Some of those very pragmatic, right? Like how often do you follow up with agencies? How often do you, what are the best communication styles? What are the best ways to answer questions? How long do you allow the process to go? So we really had the advantage of being able to tap in to their experiences. And I know that we're in Open Data Week, so obviously we're plugging open data. I would be remiss if I didn't point out a couple of parallel processes that were also super helpful for us. One is the Mayor's Office of Information Privacy, which New York City has to support the city's local privacy laws. Similarly, they have a compliance framework, and we were able to work very closely with that office, and they provided a huge amount of resources for us. Also within the Mayor's Office of Operations, we have the Mayor's Management Report, which is a gigantic twice-yearly performance reporting mechanism. And again, we were able to borrow a lot of techniques for our process with those offices. The other key thing that I think is really insightful for us, although we haven't built it on our own yet, is the culture of open data. So, look at where we are now, right? We're in Open Data Week. There is a culture of open data that is shared across the public sector, the public who are using open data, companies, right? There's a shared language, there's a shared understanding of its value. That is something that we don't have yet with open algorithms and with algorithmic management generally, but that is something that we are really looking to aspire to, because there's so much that you can get when you have that shared culture and that shared understanding. So we're really looking forward to being able to flesh that out further and using open data as a model for that. In the long run, I think that the two cultures look different because of everything that we've said before, right? Like how you're preparing and how you're presenting algorithms in a transparent reporting apparatus is going to look different. And I don't think that we would expect to see the exact same replication of that culture, but the fact of creating that shared understanding and shared experience is something that we're really looking forward to being able to build up.
Absolutely, I think the point you've raised about culture is absolutely key, and that's probably also one of the challenges in setting up a successful open algorithms movement. So I'm actually really glad that by having those conversations here, we can actually somehow contribute to that culture change, I would hope. But I'd like to ask Swazik, so in France, we've seen many interesting open data solutions. So you've got the prioritization of key open data sets that should be looked after. You've got various legislative mechanisms for open data as well. And I wonder, looking at your emerging work on algorithmic transparency and what you're currently doing as well, how does this wider landscape and this foundation of open data in France influenced your current work on algorithmic transparency?
Sure. So to give you a brief background, background context on the French legal framework, both on open data and open algorithms, actually. In parenthesis, open algorithms is a term that we should definitely discuss at some point, maybe not today, but that's definitely a term that should be discussed. But anyways, moving on. In 2016, basically in France, a law was passed called the Digital Republic Bill, which introduced a number of new legal provisions, quite innovative legal provisions regarding government, open data, and algorithms as well. And that's when we put in place a number of interesting legislative mechanisms for open data, which you mentioned, Natalia, and we also have an open data by default principle and all of these things. But that's also the law that was where specific obligations around algorithms was introduced. And fun fact, I think it's a fun fact for the type of people participating in this event. The provisions were actually proposed during a national consultation by a citizen who emphasized the need for algorithmic transparency. So now we have concretely for public sector agencies using any type of algorithm, so be it artificial intelligence, Excel spreadsheets, even analog algorithms, agencies using those to make or to inform decisions have to comply with 3 obligations. I'll mention them very briefly, but basically the first one is to mention them. So anytime you make a decision, you need to inform the citizen or even the legal entity, because it applies to both legal and individual entities. You need to inform them that you used an algorithm. So that's the first obligation. The second one is and it's actually a right for citizens and legal entities, of course, to individual explanation, meaning that anytime a decision is made, you have the right to understand what processes happened and were behind this decision. And then you have a third level, which is the general explanation level, because every agency, apart from the very, very small ones, and that includes central and both national and local agencies, are required to publish the rules behind the main algorithmic treatments that they use within their agencies, which is an obligation that we tie to a popular thing in algorithmic transparency right now, which is public registers. So that's the general explanation obligation. So basically we have these 3 legal obligations, and we have a legal bundle that we are using. And to give you a little bit of feedback about that, because actually the law has been in place for a few years now, we've seen that first, it is very useful to have a legal basis on which to ground our work with agencies. I forgot to mention that ETALAB is the French government's task force for open data and data policy. And so our job is to, part of our job is to accompany agencies with implementing legal obligations when it comes to these topics. So we've seen that the law is sort of a motivating factor for agencies who sort of feel concerned by the topic because there's a legal framework in place. However, we've seen some shortcomings as well, because the law is devoid of sanctions. So basically, if you don't respect these obligations, nothing happens to you, which is also a very French thing, I feel. But anyways, so there is sometimes a lack of incentive, especially given the lack of resources given to this new topic. So there's that. And then what we've seen as well, and that's where I can draw parallels to the work that we did on open data and sort of bridging the gap between the legislative mechanisms and their application, is that we've seen that there is a very, very important need to guide agencies and to help them put these mechanisms into place. Because when you tell them you have an obligation to general explanation, they tell you, what does that mean? Like, how do I identify what a main treatment is? How do I present it? Where do I put it? Et cetera, et cetera. And in turn, and I think this really ties in with what Alex said, we've also looked to some of the methods that we had put in place with open data in terms of processes, for example, trying to build communities of practice, trying to rely on voluntary people rather than trying to convince everyone at once. And I will also mention, the last thing that I will mention is, so in France, we really tie open, that's where we tie open data and open algorithms together, because they are part of the same law that sort of transforms the public administrative framework. One of the difference that I will mention in terms of implementation, but I think this is also more of a question for my fellow panelists afterwards, is that we are starting our communities by sort of standing on the shoulders of the open data, existing open data communities. But what we've noticed is that open algorithms or algorithmic transparency is at a crossroads between open data, data protection, and many different fields, which means that the actors that are part of these communities, I'm very relieved that I see all my fellow panelists nodding, but we come from the open data movement, but we know that we have to involve a lot more other people into these discussions. And that's sort of where we're at right now in terms of implementing these legal mechanisms, even though they stem from the same branch, let's say. Yeah, and I think that's it for me.
Great, thank you very much. And you've touched on something really, really important, I think, the multidisciplinary nature of algorithmic transparency, and on how we can involve the widest possible stakeholder networks as well. And with that, I'd like to ask Tony, our open government expert, what have we learned in terms of public engagement, but also expert engagement, and what have we learned on the public understanding of data and the use of open data through the open data movement, and how can we apply those learnings to our current work on algorithmic transparency?
Thanks, Natalia. There's a lot packed in there. Let me give that a shot. And I think I want to pick up a little bit from where I'm glad Soysik sort of brought that multidisciplinary angle to it, because that's something we're seeing a lot in conversations across countries. So just to sort of contextualize where the context or the perspective from which I see things in this conversation. So I work for a multi-stakeholder multilateral partnership called Open Government Partnership, where our 78 member countries and a growing number of civil society, business, media work together to ensure that there's transparency, accountability, and participation. And over sort of the 11 years of OGP, we have seen a lot of open data commitments, through across various contexts. And there's something that we can say pretty confidently now, is that opening up data does make government function better. But, and let's get to that but a little bit, where we have been a little bit naive, perhaps in say the first phase of this movement, is how collecting and opening up data at scale automatically leads to accountability. And I don't know if Soysik was going a little bit on the open algorithms discussion from there, but we need to make sure that we don't forget the purpose of putting out data, that transparency for the sake of transparency's sake does not lead to better decision-making, whether it's about data or algorithms. So, there was this whole sense that build it and they will come, and that doesn't necessarily work. We've often seen governments put out millions of data sets without sort of thinking about formats, access, or use necessarily, and that has not seen the uptake that one would want. So in this conversation, I think the key question to ask is not just what we do to advance algorithmic transparency, or I would argue accountability, but how do we make this more accessible, engage relevant communities to use this data, and then therefore get better informed decision-making. And finally, one of the other things that I think Soysik also brought up is algorithmic transparency kind of sits in between, and there's a balance to strike between open data and data protection, which again is the key foundation for this effort. And not all countries we see have adequate legislative mandates or systems or frameworks that look at both open data and data protection. So the last thing on this before sort of I get to what this means from some of the on algorithmic accountability necessarily is that we need to ensure that in these conversations, any standards and principles that are developed are informed both in the global north and south, informed by experiences both in the global north and south, right? So I think we talked about how there is a little bit of a northern bias in conversations around algorithmic transparency now, because that's where we are seeing initial implementation of frameworks around it. But for instance, if we look at data protection, about 25 African countries, and Millie might know the latest, have data protection in place, laws in place, and a lot of these have drawn from EU GDPR, like Kenya or South Africa, for instance. So what does that mean for implementation there when you begin drawing on frameworks elsewhere? So now, 3 lessons I do want to sort of remind us all in terms of what this means for algorithmic accountability or transparency. And we've been convening at OGP a group of implementing agencies working on algorithmic transparency in multiple jurisdictions. Natalia is part of that network. Soysik is part of this network, and we really hope to see this network grow. And a few things to highlight, I think, that have come out there as well is one, as I've been saying, is how does one move from transparency to accountability, right? So I think publishing algorithms is important, and transparency around that decision-making process, design, collection is important. Again, my previous speakers have talked about this, is how do we get to mandate? How do we get to disclosure? But even beyond that transparency, how do we look at where do you have right to recourse when there are harms or violations, or when a service is denied? What does the justiciability of these claims look like? And most importantly, who enforces this and how, right? Should there be sanctions or not? I mean, the second piece is raising awareness is so critical with relevant communities. I think across the board we've seen is when there's a scandal, then people talk about the algorithms. So there has been, Soysik referred to the case in the UK around the high school grading systems. That we had a pilot immigration program in New Zealand that brought algorithms to the headlines, and we had a Dutch case. I don't know if there's anyone on the call who remembers this, on system risk indication, where that looked at what benefits fraud detection, and all of these were scandals that then made algorithms hit the headlines. So it really shows how it's important to embed this transparency in a larger public conversation. For instance, New Zealand officials, they're really thinking about how do you engage Maori communities more in some of the specific service delivery algorithms that work with them. And finally, and I think this is where Soysik ended, so no surprises there, this is something we've seen across a lot of countries as well, is there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach, not just across countries, but also governments. government departments. So because you have agencies, and I think Alex touched on this a little bit as well in terms of how you're coordinating across the agencies, where there are specific sectoral agencies, health and social protection or justice, when they're implementing it, there is a balance to strike between how do you get a mandate, whether it's a law like in France, or an algorithmic charter like in New Zealand. How do you get a basic mandate, but then how do you leave room for different agencies to understand their own implementation priorities? But then also, how do you help get the legal experts that are needed, the design expert that is needed, those who can foster dialogue with civil society? Because algorithms is not just about tech and not just about data. How do you get that broader system in place across government departments? I think that's the final lesson I'd touch on here.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much. I don't know if Swazik or Alex, would you like to comment on any of that in terms of, especially bringing all the agencies, all the ministries on board and trying to unify this reporting system?
I think Millie was raising her hand, so I don't know if...
Yes, Millie, you are raising your hand and I can see it now. Over to you, sorry.
Raising an actual hand. Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to pick up on, Tonu, your point about the kind of, countries around the world beyond the Eurozone sort of taking up the data protection cues from GDPR. And I think it's really important that we recognize the soft power that derives from economic power, and that we think about that in terms of how we develop standards so that they are authentically multi-stakeholder and also with social equity in mind. And I think that's one thing that the open data movement can really contribute to in terms of our understanding of how open standards can be collaborative in that way, and that they can also be context sensitive rather than something emerging from the global north, top down, being, inaccessible or serving particular interests and then kind of being rolled out as a kind of global norm. So I think that's really key.
Absolutely, I can see that. We all nodding here, so for sure. Alex, would you like to?
The point that Tonu made about not one size fits all, I could not agree more. I mean, that's a mantra that we have on the tip of our tongues all the time. And you think we're just a city, right? Granted, the largest in the country by a long shot. But if you take a look at the algorithms that we've published so far, you just see so much diversity and so much variety in terms of the purpose, in terms of the mission, in terms of the tools, the models, the approach. So that adds this extra layer of complexity when you think about what it is that you're trying to communicate and how you communicate it. Because a question posed to one agency is not actually necessarily a relevant question to pose to another agency. And that particularity from agency to agency also plays into what Tonu was talking about in terms of thinking about some of the accountability pieces and what Swazik mentioned in terms of enforcement. Because a lot of these decisions that are being supported by algorithms are also governed by completely non-technological regulatory frameworks, right? So if you're using an algorithm to help support a decision and you're legally required to make that decision by statute as an agency, and that statute also contains provisions for how decisions are addressed or remediated or how citizens interact with that system, it's not as simple as saying, here is a solution to the algorithm or here's how you respond to the algorithm. You have to take that whole context of policymaking, that whole regulatory framework into consideration. And that effect really illustrates the lack of a one-size-fits-all approach, because you can't just take a regulatory algorithmic framework and expect it to not come into conflict with at least some of the other non-algorithmic regulatory frameworks that exist.
Absolutely, and I wonder just to maybe build on that. What have we learned from the open data movement in terms of data standards, data quality, and data accessibility, and what are the main challenges that we need to face in this field for algorithmic transparency? That's a question to all the panelists. So who would like to go first?
Shall I kick us off? So I've sort of touched on the 2 points before. So one is around data standards and using open standards to support both collaboration but also inclusion. And I think that when standards are not accessible, that can slow down the ability to adapt to context, but also to adapt to change. And I think it's going to be really important that we can adapt to change, because I imagine the field of developing and implementing algorithms is going to move very rapidly, So we're going to need a system that can be responsive and adaptive. and that doesn't take sort of 2 years, to respond to emerging challenges. I think also, and thinking about data as infrastructure. So if you have gaps in the infrastructure, if you have data poverty, then that's going to affect the outcomes. So I don't know, obviously kind of data gaps are going to inform the quality or challenges in the quality of the algorithms that we develop. But I wonder what the equivalent of a foundational principle is in terms of algorithmic development or algorithmic transparency, what the equivalent of data gaps would be in terms of, something that if we don't get that right, the knock-on implications will be significant and potentially either introduce or recreate structural inequalities beyond data gaps.
Absolutely. Swazik, I see you nodding. Would you like to?
Sure. I keep nodding anyways, but it's all very inspiring. When I prepared for this question, actually I was gonna basically repeat what Tonu and Millie mentioned about sort of the open, especially the open everything approach that took place in the open data movement, sort of let's just open as much as possible and then without focusing on quality. And I feel like that's already been touched upon, but that's definitely something that we're taking away and trying to avoid in our work on algorithms, especially because, as I mentioned, agencies have limited resources, and I don't think that's the way it should be, but that's the way it is. And so the question is, for example, when we talk about main treatments, what is a main treatment? What does it mean? And what does it mean for whom? And Tonu touched on this as well about who are we doing this for? What is this accountability? And ultimately, we're doing this so that citizens and organizations can exert rights and just to create a more just and inclusive society, as Millie mentioned. So I think really building these loops and these links with people who are going to use the information that's given to them is very, very important, and focusing on not necessarily what agencies want to open, for example, like the things that they would have the most information about, but focusing on what information people, citizens and society need the most. And I that's one thing I would mention. The second thing I would say, and it's not it's a little bit tangential from your question, but I think one of the drivers for open data was having positive examples of impact. And I feel like we're missing that with algorithmic accountability. As Tonu mentioned, we mostly talk about them when they're scandals, but we never talk about when this work pays off and enables maybe what you said, Millie, about open science or anything, just positive impacts. And I feel like that's something that we can also take away from what we've seen in open data, especially with agencies needing guidance, needing positive models to be motivated to do things. Of course, it's again an open-ended question to all of the panelists and everybody who's been working on this, but I feel like it can be a little bit depressing working only to avoid scandals and harms, and we sort of need to move beyond that.
Absolutely. I think we should definitely think about open algorithms all the time, not just when things go wrong. I wonder, Tonu, if there is anything you would like to add on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think very much building on what Millie and Swazik said, I think there are a few things we've seen on this point. So I think the point that Swazik really made, and I think the social equity point that Millie made is really important to underscore, right? So in the open data movement, or where we're thinking about it, how do we ensure that the feedback loops work, right? And how do we make, the important thing is who is the data for and how is it used, and then how do those feedback loops then ensure that that data is improved on? And I think those things came a little bit late into the, how do you get participation on how data is used and how to improve that data. I think that's something it would be important to get right from the beginning as much as we can in this conversation, especially given, I think, the diverse the diversity of approaches that this is taking, and as we said, in some countries, this conversation is further ahead than others. The second thing I think is, and so in OGP now we have about 78 national members, and we have a growing group of local members that range from like cities to small counties across the world. And the fascinating thing that we see is how open data is used very differently at the national and local level, but also the importance of that interplay, right? And it would be really important to see how the algorithmic accountability or transparency frameworks, especially when they are on similar sectors, work across the national and local jurisdictions in countries. And I think that kind of coordination is important, again, to think about early on in some systems like law enforcement, social protection, because this really affects communities directly. And then finally, I think the interoperability question, which I feel like in the open data conversation, you can't have an open data conversation without having an interoperability question. But I do think it is very, very important, especially as we touched on. I think because there is no one size fits all, and because there is that sectoral difference, how do we make sure that, those kind of conversations around interoperability happen early enough to inform things like procurement, like when you're talking about procurement from different vendors, when governments procure, say, algorithmic systems from external vendors, especially, what kind of conversations or what kind of standards should they be looking at to ensure that the systems talk to each other?
Great. Alex, considering that you work for a city that's essentially the size of a country, do you have any thoughts on the interoperability aspect of both open data, open algorithms, and how we can make this happen effectively?
Yeah, I would certainly identify it as one of the key challenges. I think you still see interoperability. The open data team here in New York has done absolutely amazing work over the past nearly decade of open data to think about interoperability as a core problem to solve, and they've taken very clever approaches to it that aren't necessarily just obligating agencies, put your dates in this format, kind of heavy-handed requirements, that instead speak to how can you use better data dictionaries to help explain the context, which then helps explain the disconnect between one data set and another. So relying on maybe a network or patchwork of solutions to help think about interoperability. I think one of our key focuses, and I've said this previously in the conversation today, that if we can focus on creating a culture around the purpose, the needs, the means, the requirements, the necessity of algorithmic transparency, or what we think about in New York as our general framework of algorithmic management, that actually in and of itself helps with some of the conceptual interoperability, right? Because if you are at least getting people to speak the same language around what we mean by an algorithm, it does mean this, it doesn't mean this, or maybe it means this, and sometimes it means this, but it can be, a mixed bag depending on context and time and space. That sort of thing is actually, it helps smooth some of the terrain. So, it's not going to solve every single tactical problem that you necessarily have, thinking about the standardization from place to place. But it certainly at least creates a more stable environment in which to have those conversations. You just have to put a lot of attention into building this culture.
Great. Very important. It's always about the culture, isn't it? But really, really great point. Millie.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Natalia. I wondered if I could just pick up on one of the points that Swazik made about the challenges that agencies have in sort of thinking about algorithmic transparency and lessons learned from the open data movement. So I think there's a difference between open in principle versus open with purpose. And some of the work that we've been doing around sort of open cities has been around the way that open data fits into the city strategy, rather than trying to make the city strategy be open data on principle, So it's thinking, well, what is the purpose of this? So in the case of algorithmic transparency, maybe it's what is the purpose of this algorithm? And is this the best way to achieve that outcome? Because not every problem is a technology problem. And I think that would also help choose the right use cases with clear benefits and strategic value. And maybe that could be seen as an aspect of algorithmic transparency and accountability for introducing an algorithm in the first place, And then that way, at least if there are mistakes, and that's inevitable because this is a new technology, that would have been considered in the decision to introduce it in the first place. So it's the difference between doing something in principle versus doing it with purpose, and there being a transparency and accountability for that purpose in consideration of the best tools that we have.
Absolutely. So I have so many questions I could ask you, but I'd like to open it up for some audience questions that we have on Slido. So the first one is, should open algorithms be merged into the open data movement? Instead of seeing them as separate, should we include open algorithms with the open data system? Anyone would like to take this one?
I mean, I can say really briefly that I think open analytics is a really good idea, and that's from the open science movement. It's that rigor, that robustness, and then also that kind of scope to collaborate and innovate. So that's the bit that I'd find really valuable. So maybe rather than open algorithms, I would say open analytics.
Great, thank you. We have another question on how do you think about understandability as a part of transparency in open algorithms? So for example, if a system is open but extremely technical or hard to understand. And I will throw this one to Tanu because you work across so many countries that I'm sure that's something that you've covered in your work.
Yeah, absolutely. No, and I think this is critical for algorithms, right? Because, and this is something, so I think, Natalia, you would recall from conversations we've had with our fellow implementing agencies that we've seen in other countries. And I think one of the challenges that we've seen, or at least heard from countries, is how do we break down a conversation of the technology versus the problem that it seeks to solve, right? So I think that is where that understandability comes in. Is when you're talking about service delivery, or you're talking about enforcement, whether you're talking about, well, how do you as a citizen or you as a consumer interact with the system? How do we just focus on the system in engagement versus trying to explain that this is the technology that's used? And I think that's the key challenge, that, or at least that's the key goal we should work with in terms of looking at algorithmic transparency, because I think it very often the conversations, including on panels such as this, very much is around, well, how do you look at like disclosure of the source code, or how do we look at, what are the kind of registers, or like what kind of like standards should be set. But when you're talking to, when you're having a conversation with agencies who are implementing sort of social programs or welfare programs or others, how do you encourage them to, in consultations with civil society, and countries like Soizik has done some of this and may be able to touch on this as well, but certainly other countries where such consultations have happened, or at the city level where such consultations have happened, like in Helsinki or Amsterdam, I think the conversation very much starts from what is that program, or what is that service that is looking to be is accessed by a community as a first point of conversation. So I think understandability is key if we're talking about algorithmic transparency and broader community engagement.
Great, thank you very much. So another question we have is, algorithms evolve over time to accommodate for algorithm decay. How challenging it is to keep these algorithms open when they keep evolving? That's a really good question, actually, and I think it covers some challenges with the that we had in the open data movement as well, doesn't it? So, any takers? No.
I can maybe say one thing about it. Here again, obviously the principle of diversity within the algorithmic ecosystem comes into play, of course, because algorithms will change in different ways and in different over different time periods, depending on their particular use, their particular model, et cetera. One thing that we have factored in is that, again, borrowing from open data, our reporting is annual. So we have an annual cycle of reporting. So it's not just, we published our directory and that's all we've got. This will be an ongoing routine exercise from year to year. And just like with open data, over the course of its 8 to 9 years of existence, that process itself will change over time to be able to account for specific needs, specific requirements, changes in the way that agencies do business. But just creating the predictability of a cycle is one way to account for that.
Great, and I think what's really excellent in your work is that you've made that really explicit. So you've actually set this expectation, so people know when this information is going to be updated, which is really important. And I see, Swazik, you've commented in the chat. Would you like to?
Sure. I was just building on the understandability point that was already made, but I just wanted to mention that sometimes we think of algorithmic transparency is only targeted towards people who are the targets of decisions, whereas a lot of the tools that are used in government are used by public servants who themselves don't master them. And that can lead to a lot of errors, and over time, especially, the knowledge of the system sort of diminishes. And so we've seen that just explainability is a key point to help them understand how the decisions that they're making work, especially when the algorithm is one part of the process. So not necessarily fully automated decisions, but when an algorithm comes into play. And when I say algorithm, I'll mention it again, but I mean artificial intelligence, which can be very, very complex, but also just like macro spreadsheets, which are very, very used in government. And even those are sometimes quite not as well understood as they could. So yeah, that's it.
Great, and I think we could probably have a separate session on how do we define an algorithm in algorithmic transparency measures. So maybe that's an idea for a New York Open Data Week next
and a whole separate section just on the concept of explainability. Like that in of itself could be like 3 or 4 panels.
Exactly. So there we go. I hope someone is noting those ideas, because we already have a full lineup of algorithmic transparency events. So there is another question, which is definitely to Swazik. So is the French law on algorithms explainability not a direct implementation of the principles laid down in GDPR? And how does it go beyond the EU level obligations?
Okay, I'll try to be brief because this is very specific. So, and I don't, but it is interesting. The first thing is that we're not only talking about individuals. So it actually goes beyond the scope of personal data protection, because the law on algorithmic transparency pertains to both legal and individual entities. So basically, you have transparency and accountability requirements for algorithms that are used to make decisions about a company, which is not the case for the GDPR framework. And then the other thing is that the French framework doesn't discriminate between fully automated and partially automated systems. That's one of the other differences. We don't have such a distinction, which actually makes it easier. We have it for some very, very specific legal provisions, but on the whole, we don't have it. Whereas GDPR is very focused on fully automated decisions, which sometimes creates confusion. So that's another specificity that I would mention. But if you also want to shoot me an email to learn more about the French legal framework, I'll gladly answer any questions after this panel.
Great. So we've got a couple of more questions. Is there a daily international news feed that supports advocacy on open data and open algorithms? I don't know, but if there is one, then please let me know. I don't know if any of you've heard of. No, me neither. But hopefully, maybe that's another idea we should take away. And the final audience question is, in response to COVID, many researchers have moved towards using synthetic data to protect individual privacy. How do we also protect group and community privacy? That's a good one.
May I speak to this, Natalia? Yep. So I think it's one of the, the GDPR has been fantastic, but one area that I think it could have been more developed in is the notion of group privacy and group rights, and also thinking about the impacts of something on a community, not just on individuals. So that's something that I think is yet to be explored, and that we need to have better considerations in terms of data ethics and data protection around. I'd also say that, I think that the landscape of opportunities and risks is going to keep evolving. So I think it's more about having frameworks and processes that are adaptive rather than fixed. So no, we don't know yet what the perfect solution will be, and maybe there isn't one. But it's the kind of having a framework that allows evolution of decision making in response to our understanding itself developing. And I think that's also why collaborative problem solving is really key, because no single expert or institution has the answer. But it's about that long-term resilience and sustainability, because there's trust that the process itself is going to accommodate change and accommodate critical feedback.
Great. Anyone else would like to add anything to this question? Okay, so before we finish for today, I have a closing question to all the panelists, and that's one with a short answer, please. So what is the most important lesson from the open data movement that we need to remember when working in algorithmic transparency? And I know it's really hard to pick one, but please try. Let's start with Alex.
I would say just get started. Don't wait to divine a perfect solution. Don't wait for every single question to have been answered. Again, open data, we're in like year 9 or something like that in New York City, and it's still growing, still changing. So, it's always going to change. So just get started.
Fantastic. Thank you. Millie.
What I love about the open data movement is that it's truly international, and that it rallies people from all sorts of disciplines and backgrounds around shared goals, even though their priorities are different. I think that the root value of kind of collaboration and kind of evolution has allows it to be so sustainable and so accommodating, and it'd be great to take that forward.
Thank you very much. Tonu.
I think the open data movement and open data has moved from just open data as a discipline to open data as an approach. And I think that can be used across sectors, across geographies, across policy areas. And I think that's where we need to get at with algorithmic transparency, is understanding that nuance of how it can be used as an approach rather than a standalone sort of truth in a way.
Thank you. And Swazik?
I'd say find willing people and get started with them to build the communities that we kept mentioning during the panel, relying on people.
Thank you. I think we have a lot to build on from this. So thank you so much to all my fantastic panelists. Thank you for joining, and thanks for all your really, really insightful contributions. And of course, thank you to the New York City Mayor's Office of Data Analytics and BetaNYC for organizing the whole week of fantastic open data events. And the whole festival runs until March 14th. So there's still time if you would like to learn more about open data and join other virtual events. And thank you so much.
Thank you very much.